Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining us tonight. I'm Stephanie Baker with Team Celeste, and you're here with us tonight for our bi-weekly virtual town hall. I'm joined tonight by Celeste Williams, nurse practitioner and candidate for U.S. Congress in District 3, and Senator Greg Leding from District 4 near Fayetteville, kind of close to where Celeste and I are. And we're going to talk tonight about tenants' rights, evictions, especially in the time of COVID. I'm going to let Greg introduce himself to everybody really quickly. Greg, would you like to say hi to everyone?
Hey, good evening. I'm happy to be here. I'm thrilled that Celeste is running for Congress. Let's make sure we get her elected here in 75 days, I think we decided earlier. But yes, state senator for District 4. It includes Fayetteville, Farmington, and then parts of Greenland, Prairie Grove, and West Fork.
Great, thanks. Celeste, would you like to give a greeting to our viewers tonight as well?
I am so glad that everyone who is watching has joined us tonight, and I'm excited to have this conversation. And I would like to add that all of Greg's district is within the 3rd Congressional District. If I'm wrong, correct me, but I'm pretty sure that's correct.
Pretty sure.
I think it'll be a good conversation. So.
Great. So I just want to remind everybody watching that if you have questions, we'd love to hear from you. So go ahead and put those in the comments and I will be monitoring those on my phone. So if you see me scrolling and looking down, that's what I'm doing. I'm trying to interact with you guys and make sure that your questions are heard tonight. So we're going to start with Greg. Greg, tenant rights is a topic that you've talked about for a long time. I'm sure anyone who follows you on Twitter or Facebook has heard you discuss this. I've heard you and others say before that Arkansas is one of the worst states in which to be a renter. Can you give our viewers a brief summary of why? Why is that?
Yes, and it's actually worse than that. We are literally the worst state in the country for renters, and it's for a number of reasons. And just to give a real quick background, in 2012, the Non-Legislative Commission on the Study of Landlord-Tenant Laws got together and reviewed our laws. All the stakeholders that would need to be there were involved, and they highlighted about 15 really big problems for renters in our state, including the fact that there's no prohibition on retaliatory eviction, that we don't really have reasonable restrictions on landlord access to tenants' homes. But the two biggest sins highlighted by the commission were our lack of an implied warranty of habitability and our criminal eviction statute. With regard to the warranty of habitability, this basically means that there are no minimum safety or habitability standards for residential rental premises in Arkansas. And we are the only state in the country without these kinds of protections. And what this essentially means is that so long as someone is willing to pay money to live in a space, it's considered habitable, regardless of whether it's got running water, electricity, or floors. And that's pretty awful. And with regards to the criminal eviction statute, it's one of the couple of ways that people can be evicted in Arkansas. Basically, if you fail to pay rent the day it's due, a landlord can give you 10 days notice to vacate the premises. And if you don't, you could be charged with a misdemeanor in addition to paying a $25 fine every day that you are in the premises beyond that 10-day warning. And again, we are the only state in the country where you could end up in jail if you fail to pay rent. And so two of the biggest reasons that we can't pass meaningful reforms, at least during the time that I've been involved with this process, is opposition from the Arkansas Realtors Association and the fact that so many lawmakers themselves are landlords and they're not necessarily inclined to pass meaningful reforms.
Very interesting. With Celeste being a nurse practitioner, her experience is obviously related to the health side of this. And I've heard Celeste speak before about social determinants of health. So when we're talking about people who are experiencing anxiety and stress and potential homelessness, can you talk a little bit about that for our viewers, Celeste?
Yeah. So social determinants of health is sort of the study to explain both the social and physical components of the environment that keep us healthy, like clean air, having safe and habitable housing, those types of things. And so it really does make a big difference on someone's overall health. You know, there's a lot of really good information on the CDC, World Health Organization, and the best place that I find is Healthy People 2020, which when I was in graduate school and in my undergraduate studying nursing, I hated those websites, but I find them really useful now. And there is a lot of really good information. So one of their premises for doing this research is that all Americans deserve an equal opportunity to make choices that lead to good health. And so, we can kind of, people can't control their genetic predispositions to health, but we can look at the impacts of the environment. So if someone lives and lives, like I said, in a safe home, their workplace, schools, having access to good paying jobs, those sort of things make a tremendous difference in someone's health. And, I think just as an example, I have taken care of patients who have advanced lung disease, and every winter they get into trouble breathing and have a whole lot of problems. And, I think of one particular person that she and I sat and visited for quite some time and realized that she didn't have central heat and air. So she was using a wood burning stove to heat her house and stay warm, which that smoke was really aggravating her lungs and making it terribly difficult for her to breathe. And so, after having that conversation, we came up with a plan that just every year when it starts getting cold and you're going to be heating your house that way, you need to start on this particular inhaler, and we're going to do all that we can to reduce those risks, because we want to make sure that I keep her out of the hospital and that she is also warm in her home. But when you think about, COVID is certainly a risk factor for people's overall health and well-being. And then when you think about, especially I think of people in the hospitality industry as an example, who have lost their job, they don't have, that income that they can count on because the CARES Act has stopped adding that $600 a month extra to their unemployment benefits, that now they may not have money to make ends meet. And so we have to think about the impact of their health if they then also become homeless. And of course, in that meantime as well, they probably lost their health insurance because they don't have a job that they can actually afford to pay for that, which health insurance as well, access to health insurance and then health care is also a determinant of health. And so it really is, I have been harping recently that we really need to make sure that our science is leading policy rather than trying to politicize the science and force a particular view. Poverty is not a moral failing, but what we do need to do is set up a system that sets people up for a more just and equitable life so that they can really have opportunities to succeed. I mean, that's always the American dream, that you can come from anywhere, any background, any walk of life, and be able to succeed. And so I think it is really important that we think about these policies, how it affects the health of our communities. And, I certainly think that Senator Letting has been a champion for safe housing. And I think, that means a lot to a lot of people. If you are someone who is renting, that place that you're living isn't guaranteed to remain your own. It belongs to someone else. And I think it's very important to have protection of your rights to a safe and habitable place to live. And I certainly have memories of working with nurses' aides who lived in a rent house, one in particular who had a hole in her ceiling and during the winter time could watch the snowflakes drift into her bedroom. And she was stuck there. There was no way that she could get out of her lease, and she couldn't get her landlord to fix her home. That's crazy.
Yes, that's unacceptable for sure. You mentioned in the time of COVID how this is especially complicated with people who are losing their income, their livelihood, and the job market's just not there for people who need to find something else. So Greg, I was going to ask you, I know when the CARES Act was passed, it did give some protections to renters, and part of those have expired. So can you explain to our viewers what protections were available and what has expired and what do they have left now?
Right. So the CARES Act was signed into law on March 27th of this year. And among the things it provided for renters was a 120-day moratorium on evictions. So landlords could not issue a notice of eviction during those 120 days, meaning that July 25th would have been the first day that they could have issued an eviction notice. And any notice issued on that day would have to come with at least 30 days notice, meaning that nobody would be evicted until August 24th. That day is now right upon us. There were a couple of other relief measures included in the bill, including about it was $17.3 billion to the Department of Housing and Urban Development for rental assistance. But the big key thing was that moratorium on evictions. The problem was that it only affected about half of the 44 million renter households in the country. The biggest chunk of them were any rental properties that were purchased or supported through federally backed mortgages or loans. Then there were a couple of other groups in there, like the Rural Housing Voucher Program, or if the property was also covered by one section of the Violence Against Women Act. But it really focused mostly on just properties that were backed by federal loans or mortgages. And again, that was only a small, or about half of the renters in the country. And that protection is now expired. Now, independent of the CARES Act, there were 43 states plus DC that put in place their own moratoriums on evictions. Unfortunately, only 22 of those moratoriums are still in place. And we have seen as you mentioned, the unemployment benefits have expired now that were part of the CARES Act. And there are still a lot of jobs that aren't there. So people are still missing income. And we are worried that we are going to continue to see more evictions as we get closer to the year. And in fact, the Aspen Institute estimates that between 19 and 23 million Americans could be evicted between now and the end of the year. And as it stands right now, where there's been about a $22 billion shortfall in rent paid to landlords during the pandemic. And so renters in this country are struggling. They're especially struggling here in Arkansas. And that's not to say that landlords aren't struggling too. There are, they also need their own relief, but the priority has got to be on low income and working Arkansans and working Americans and being able to keep them in their homes, because nobody should be evicted during a pandemic just because their job is no longer there or is no longer safe and they can't earn income.
Senator Leding, what you just mentioned about protections for landlords, we have a question coming in from a viewer that is kind of in line with that. And that's something I've heard other people talk about, like not everyone who's a landlord actually is independently wealthy. Some people rely on this for income as well. Or I know a few years ago, I couldn't sell a house when I was moving to a new one. And so I had to become a landlord against my will. That does happen sometimes as well. So the question here is, how do you protect small business owners who rely on that income from getting those rental payments and that sort? And I guess this is more of a business question, if a business is paying mortgage to a landlord.
I don't know that I could speak to small businesses, but as you point out, there are like independent landlords out there. And I've spoken to a couple throughout the pandemic who reached out very early on to say, hey, I know you're concerned about renters. I am too. I'm also a landlord. I'm trying to be as flexible as I can with my tenant. And that's great. And should state that a lot of landlords have done a lot to give their tenants some flexibility, not all of them across the board, but a good number of them. But in terms of providing relief to the landlords, what we've been looking for is perhaps mortgage relief from banks. And in some instances, I've heard where there's been some success. I have a friend who no longer lives in the state, but he kept the house he owns in Fayetteville. He was renting it to a single mother who was waiting tables. She lost her job just right out of the gate when the pandemic started. And he let her know immediately that he would do everything he could to work with her. And he was able to buy her some time, and largely thanks to the fact that he was able to work with his bank and get a little, some pressure relieved through whatever arrangement they were able to come to. So yeah, again, it is important to note that there are landlords out there who are doing right by their tenants and have tried to give flexibility, but can't afford to do that forever. And so it is important that landlords and relief for them are a part of the conversation when we talk about renter relief.
I'd like to add to, I think that when we're looking at really big problems, the correct entity to address that is the federal government. And so I think that the federal government needs to make sure that they're keeping landlords whole as well. And as much as I despise bank bailouts, but what that is that's saving the little guy as well, the individual who is a landlord and has a rental property or two. They need to be protected as well, because this certainly isn't their fault. It isn't their renter's fault. And you know, as we've said, we don't want people to become homeless. I certainly spend a fair amount of time worrying about returning to the days during the Depression with the Hooverville areas that were a large group of homeless people living together in tents and makeshift shelter. And that's certainly a recipe for disease to be spread about as well. And things certainly beyond just COVID. So we want to make sure that people are kept in safe areas that can be sanitary.
And just to follow up on that briefly, the eviction moratorium that was put in place as part of the CARES Act didn't get anybody out of having to pay their rent. People were still obligated to pay their rent. They just couldn't be evicted for failure to do so on time. And you're right, that's an important part of making sure that landlords are able to stay in business as well.
Mm-hmm. So actually that was going to be my next question to you, Celeste. I want to remind our viewers, if you have questions, go ahead and put them in the comments and we'll get to as many as we can. But Celeste, what should our federal government be doing? What would you do if you were elected right now? What would you be pushing for?
One, I would be pushing for that. And two, I certainly would support the HEROES Act. There's also the Republican answer to that, which is the HEALS Act, which doesn't address renters in need at all. So I think that really pushing for that HEROES Act to be passed. Both the Republicans and the Democrats have said that they would like to have an additional $1,200 stimulus to help prop up the economy. So I think that's important as well. There's also money allocated for testing and tracing, so that we can have more contact tracers hired to be able to do the important work of letting people know that their contacts have been exposed to COVID. And certainly I think, you know, that's the underlying issue of all of this conversation is, please, let's have some leadership and actually address the cause of all of these economic problems. And these problems will continue to compound and get worse and worse, and will be in a bigger and deeper economic hole if we do not follow the science and address the virus. And we know what that is: wear a mask, wash your hands, watch your distance as individuals. And then as a government, we need to make sure that everybody can get a test when they need it, and that's paid for, and that we make sure that there are enough testing supplies. There are groups in this area, healthcare providers, that have run out of the quick test now. And that's really important, especially when you're in a hospital, to be able to answer that question rapidly. Does this person have COVID or not? And, it's not okay if somebody is critically ill, especially with the staff around them being exposed, to have to wait 4 or 5 days or more to get those test results back. And so this continues to be the same thing that we've been talking about from the beginning, is using the power of the federal government to make sure that we have protective equipment and that we have testing supplies, and that we continue to invest in ramping up our ability to do contact tracing. And then beyond that, we need to make sure that, we're paying for a lot of this R&D for vaccine manufacturing on the hope that it's going to be an effective and safe vaccine, which as soon as it is proven safe and effective, I will be taking that. We need to be making sure that that's then also affordable. I don't believe that we should make people pay several $100s to get this vaccine that our federal government is paying for, and then just allowing large companies to pad their pockets with profit. We need to make sure that the U.S. government is being very judicious in its use of taxpayer dollars, and it's our money, and we need to make sure that the government is being responsible with it and that we're not being just fleeced to transfer wealth from everyday Americans back into the pockets of the wealthy few in our country.
Amen.
I'm
gonna
today.
You did. I love it. Celeste, bring in the fire. I'm going to go to a few more viewer questions. This one I'm not familiar with this, but Greg, you might be. This viewer is asking, what are your thoughts on protecting source of income discrimination under fair housing, like Section 8 vouchers? Do you know anything about that?
Not enough to give any kind
Okay.
of good answer, but I will learn more.
Okay, we will learn more. Thank you, Angela, for your question. We will figure that out and get back to you. And I'm seeing a lot of comments coming through. You know, we were talking about independent landlords and small businesses. A lot of comments coming through saying that's not really the problem. The problem is corporate landlords and giant apartment buildings and landlords who own thousands of properties. Is that what you're seeing, Greg? You mentioned before we went live that you're hearing a lot from constituents who need help. Are they in these kind of situations?
I've heard from many who rent from Lindsay, and in fact, just last week, local pastor Clint Schnickloff organized a rally outside Lindsay Management's headquarters to protest what they've been doing. They have been evicting tenants who have been unable to pay. And there was one woman there that day who she and her husband had been tenants with Lindsay for, I think she said 7 years, had never missed a rent payment. When they were late earlier this year because of COVID related reasons, Lindsay was going to evict them. And fortunately, they were able to work together with their extended family to come up with the money they needed to stay in their apartment. But she has said that they will be moving and finding another place to live because of the way Lindsay handled that situation. And you're right. That's a very powerful, very large company that could do a lot to protect people. And we do see, at least in the people I've been hearing from, do tend to live in more corporate managed apartments as opposed to more individual landlords. The individual landlords I know, most of them very early on, again, reached out and talked about how they were going to do everything they could to accommodate renters that might not be able to make rent on time.
Yeah. And this other question we've kind of addressed, talking about what the state and federal government could be doing to help people when they're in these situations. But the specific question is about what resources are available right now. Do you have any advice for folks who are struggling to pay rent, who maybe are in evictions proceedings and want to fight those? Are there resources that you know of that we can point those folks to?
Fortunately, Arkansas is not one of the 36 states that created rental relief funds. I know some local municipalities, including Fayetteville, have pulled together a little bit of money to try and provide some relief. So there are in certain places stuff like that. I think a lot of renters, particularly if they're very low income, they might not realize that just because you get issued an eviction notice doesn't mean you've been evicted. You can get legal help. The challenge is that unfortunately so many might not know that, or they might not be able to afford legal help. And so I would encourage people, if you are facing problems with your landlord, reach out to Legal Aid of Arkansas. And in fact, I've got the number handy right here. It's 1-800-952-9243. And they can hopefully provide you some counsel and help guide you through that process.
Will you repeat that number? I'll go ahead and put that in the comments.
Absolutely. It's 1-800-952-9243, and that's Legal Aid of Arkansas.
Okay. That's a very good resource for folks to have. And I will say over the course of the last few weeks, the Celeste campaign page has been we've been reached out to by folks who are trying to help neighbors who have been going through this or who are already evicted and experiencing homelessness. And so I had actually reached out to Clint Schneekloth as well, a pastor in Fayetteville, to ask what can we do. He also mentioned the Fayetteville Housing Authority. If someone is in Fayetteville, I guess they're able to help as well. Let me finish putting this in the comments for folks. Legal Aid of Arkansas, and that phone number is now there if anyone would like to write that down and share that with folks.
There's also, if you live in a, I think it's 4 or more multi-family property, or it's 5 or more units, then there's a tool available, published by the National Low Income Housing Coalition, that lets you see if that property where you live was covered under the CARES Act. So I can text it to you later, and we can post it
I'll put
later
it
in the comments.
for sure.
But that may be useful. You know, I do think that we have to hold larger corporations that are for-profit entities to a little bit of a higher standard. And certainly my bias is always to look out for the little guy rather than those who are already doing really well.
I want to circle back and talk again about the HEROES Act, because I know that your opponent voted against it. Can you explain to our viewers why you would have supported it and what was included in that act?
Yeah, so one of the things, which I'm just thinking of a community that has been disproportionately affected by not only the COVID virus, but also by loss of housing, has been the Marshallese community. And one of the things that was in there that is not talked about as much is that it restores their ability to get access to Medicaid, which they had, and then they lost. That was legislatively taken away. And so that's one thing that I think is super important. Aside from that, the HEROES Act covered worker safety, supports small businesses and not-for-profits. It preserves health coverage, extends unemployment benefits, and that's really, I think, what's really important right now, especially when there's not a job market that's thriving for people to go back to, especially if there's somebody who works in like the hospitality industry. And, you know, Arkansas is also a state where there's a whole lot of tourism, and that really has been decimated as well. And so, you know, it is important to access those benefits so that people can stay in their home, be able to buy food, access healthcare in this time while we're waiting for the COVID pandemic to be addressed and defeated, I guess is a reasonable term, so that they can then have an economy to go back to. And then it's going to be really important for us to think about what kind of economy we want to create. Obviously, normal is what got us here. And so the coronavirus has certainly been really good at just highlighting all of the weaknesses that were already there in our society. And I think it's important for us to really kind of imagine a more just and equitable society and think about, okay, how do we get there? And again, I always come back to my social determinants of health. What are the barriers in place that make that hard for people in this country to thrive? And certainly, you know, when we're thinking of the Marshallese community, they don't have a right to vote. They don't have health care. They have on average an income in the around $30,000 annually. And they're living in areas of concentrated poverty. And all of those things we know contribute to having poor health. And then if you add in the environmental concerns as well, or the physical concerns, you know, they immigrated from a country that it has a lot of radioactive activity because we bombed it with a nuclear bomb. And so we expect that they're going to have poorer health outcomes. And I think that's morally wrong. So we should create a way to lift everyone up. And, you know I talk about the Marshallese population a lot, but it's really looking at everyone, every single person. You know, I think about as a little girl, I grew up in rural Oklahoma in a trailer. And so making sure that I had, you know, with asthma, so I needed to make sure that I had clean air to breathe and a place to play safely. And those are things that we need to think about for everybody.
Absolutely. We are getting close to our end of time together tonight. One of the questions here was, how can we get these laws changed to prevent situations and provide assistance for the next pandemic or emergency? And I think that's a good question to end on, because I've heard you say that before, Celeste, that, you know, we weren't prepared for this, but we should have been. You were not surprised that this happened. And you've already told me that we're going to have another pandemic, which makes my heart really sad. But let's talk about that.
So I think, who represents you in government matters. And I think that oftentimes we have this unhealthy view that whoever we elect as president is going to just solve everything. And that is garbage. We're not electing a king. We are not electing a savior. We are electing an executive who will hopefully do a good job of managing the U.S. government and following the laws that Congress needs to pass. And so, whether it is local government, state government, or federal, change happens in the legislature. And so we need to, and I said that, it probably sounds funny, but like in our counties in Arkansas, the justice of the peace sort of functions like a legislature. And so those people all have a huge impact on your life and really the quality of life. And if they're not thinking about all of those social determinants of health and making a community in which we can all succeed, then we are failing. And so I think it's very important to, in this time as we near the election, I think it's very important for people to, number one, commit to vote. Number two, make a plan of how you're going to vote. If you're going to vote by mail, you need to request your ballot now. Make sure that you include your photo ID in that ballot, because this is a photo ID state, that you get every single space in that ballot filled out correctly, that you don't accidentally put anything incorrectly, or else your vote's not going to count. And so if you're not super confident that you're going to be able to get that filled out and meet all the requirements and get it back in a really early fashion, because we already know that the Postal Service is in a bit of a pickle right now. We need to, if you can't do that and you are able, and it is, and you're not a high-risk person, that it is important that you go vote early. Don't wait till the last day to go stand in a giant line with a bunch of people. Go vote early. I personally will be voting in person and voting early. And then the other thing that I would encourage you to do, well, I'm going to back up just a little bit more and say that, democracy is, in my view, the best form of government. And it is a form of government that is by the people and for the people. And for us to have a healthy democracy, that requires us as individuals to really view it as our civic duty to make sure that we know who's running, what do they believe, how are they going to legislate, because I certainly, and how are they going to govern? Are they going to be someone who's really concerned about everyday Americans, or are they more concerned about getting corporate donors to give them more money for their next campaign so that they can stay in office and maintain power for no other reason other than holding power, which to me is abhorrent. So I would also then encourage you to really get involved, get active, and find a candidate to support, whether it is someone running for justice of the peace, running for state house, state legislature. I would love to have your help. Get involved, and you can make a difference, and you can really participate in your democracy and really work to make sure that we all have the opportunities that we want, that nobody goes broke because they get sick, that we have a world-class education, and that workers in America are paid a fair wage. And those are all things that your legislators can affect and really make sure that they are working for policy that helps us all. So we can post a link of how you can volunteer for the campaign, whether it's writing postcards, making phone calls, text banking, and if all of that just sounds terrible and you just think, oh, I don't want to do all that work, then you can always assuage your guilt and donate. You can donate up to $2,800 per individual, per campaign, per election cycle. So I need your help. And so do all the wonderful candidates down ballot.
Absolutely. And if you guys follow Senator Letting on Twitter, you will have seen him tweeting, which candidates are you guys supporting right now? Who are you working to get elected? And that's exactly how you affect change. You elect better leaders who are responsive, who are willing to listen, and who have lived in your shoes. That's how you affect change. So with that, we are over our time. Senator Ledding, I'm going to let you give us any closing thoughts before we leave, and then I'll have one more question from here that I want to mention to everybody. Go ahead.
I don't know what I can really add to what Celeste had to say, other than we've got 75 days that we get no do-overs or second chances come November 4th, the day after the election. So leave everything out there on the field, work to help your favorite candidate get elected. And then once you get them elected, stay in contact with them and contact them about issues that are important to you, and just stay on top of them.
Absolutely. And I think that's an important point. Our work doesn't end on November 3rd. We have to work as hard as we can to change our legislators, but then you have to stay on them and make sure that you hold them accountable. And Celeste wants you to do that. Senator Ledding wants you to do that. They want to hear from you. They are responsive public servants, as they should be. The one question I wanted to get to on here, somebody was asking, will there be a Williams-Womack debate? And there will be. It'll be on AETN in October. I believe we're filming it on October 13th. I'd have to look at our schedule, but that seems right. So yes, you guys all tune in for that, and we look forward to that. I'm sure there are many of you who want to hear answers from him as well. Celeste, would you like to say goodnight to everyone before we go?
I think I will. Yes. Thank you all for joining us. I really appreciate each and every one of you. And our democracy is on the line this election cycle. So please get involved. And my child is crashing our little end of meeting, who is tickled pink with herself now.
Lovely. Thank you all for joining us. We will be doing our more casual chat with Celeste on Facebook Live next Thursday. We're calling that our Firefly Chat series, and I love it. So tune in and ask questions then. Our next formal virtual hall will be September 3rd. We'll be discussing immigration with a local Raj Suresh. Will be joining us to talk about his personal experience with that. So thanks, everybody. Thank you, Senator Ledding. Thank you, Celeste. Good night.